Hi friends, Andrew Goodall here from Nature's Image Photography with another video on the Panasonic Lumix G9. This time I'm putting together a full summary of my entire camera setup. But before we get started, I would love it if you hit that subscribe button so you can stay in touch with all my future content on the G9 and my world of photography. Up until now I've made a whole bunch of videos on individual features of the G9. With each new video I get some questions, and sometimes those questions relate to something I've already covered in a different video. For example, if I do a video about autofocus, I get a question about metering. I do a video about a lens and I get a question about ISO. So now I'm going to be a bit more ambitious and try to give you the full picture of how I use the camera for day-to-day photography, with the functions I use all the time and the functions I use for individual subjects. It's going to be a bit longer than my usual videos, but for some of you it might be the only one you need to watch. I'm going to look at different functions one by one and how to set them up on the camera, but if you stick with me right to the end of the video, I'm also going to explain how I put them all together for different types of photography, a bit like showing the recipes for my favourite fancy dishes. Now, I'm not pretending this is the way everyone should be doing it, it's just the way I do it. If you're an experienced photographer, you might have your own way of doing things, but if you're still learning, I think you're going to find this really helpful. First, I want to look at what I call the set and forget features. These are the things I set up way back when I first got the camera and I've never had to touch them again. Let's start with image quality. I shoot RAW files, always have, always will. That means I have to do a little extra work on my images in post-processing, but I have more potential to produce the best quality photos. So one of the first things I did when I got the G9 was to make sure my image quality was set to RAW. To do this, go into the first part of the menu and right away you'll see the quality heading. In here you have a few options including high and low quality JPEG, RAW plus high and low quality JPEG, and then RAW, which is the one I use. If you don't know the difference between RAW and JPEG, you're probably best to stick with the default JPEG setting until you learn a bit more about shooting RAW. But if you're ready for shooting RAW, it's very easy to set up and you'll probably never have to visit that part of the menu again. My next set and forget function is on the exposure mode dial. I shoot in manual mode, again always have, always will. Switching to manual mode is about as easy as it gets, just turn the mode dial on top of the camera to M. Shooting in manual means I set the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO myself. Now I had a couple of other things to change to make sure manual exposure works the way I want it to. First, I had to reverse the shutter speed and aperture dials. I've already done a video on this, so to make a long story short, I wanted the shutter speed dial at the front and the aperture dial at the back. By default on the G9 it's the other way around. Happily, it's an easy thing to customize those dials. All I had to do was go into the third part of the menu, choose Operation, and then find the Dial Set heading. Here you can assign the aperture and shutter speed functions to either the front or back depending on your preference. While you're at it, you can also reverse the dial rotation from clockwise to anti-clockwise or vice versa if you want to. Again, once you have things set up to your liking, you probably never have to look at this again. So now I change my shutter speed by turning the dial on top of the camera, and I change my aperture by turning the dial on the back. I change the ISO by pressing the ISO button on top of the camera and then turning the rear dial to choose my ISO setting. That's pretty straightforward, but I also wanted to change the steps in the ISO settings. Instead of going up in full stops from ISO 200 to 400 to 800 and so on, it's possible to change that so it goes up in smaller steps, a third of a stop at a time. I think this is worth doing because on a micro four thirds camera, photos can get noisy at higher ISO. So being able to jump up in smaller increments is a worthwhile feature. To do that, go back into the third part of the menu, choose Exposure and find the ISO Increments heading. Here you can go from a full stop or exposure value to a 1/3 EV, which is what I prefer. So as you can see, I can change the ISO a third of a stop at a time, which gives me just a little extra control over exposure and image quality. My next set and forget function is something you might have noticed already. A great asset when shooting in manual is to have my screen set to constant preview. That means when I change my aperture and shutter speed, the screen, and this is true for the rear screen and for the viewfinder, gets brighter and darker, so I get a real-time preview of what my shot will look like before I press the button. Combined with a traditional light meter, it takes pretty much all the guesswork out of finding the correct exposure. To enable constant preview, go into the third part of the menu and select the Monitor Display heading. Then find the constant preview setting and switch it on. It's as simple as that. If you haven't enabled constant preview, I recommend it, especially if you're using exposure compensation or shooting in manual mode the way I do. My final set and forget is my metering mode. Just as I've done with all my DSLR cameras, I set my metering to multi, the same as what other cameras call matrix metering or evaluative metering. With constant preview plus the ability to see my photo the moment I take it, I really don't see any need to change my metering for different situations, and multi-metering does a great job for almost anything. To set up your metering mode, click the Function 2 button to go into the quick menu, then find the metering function. You can use the arrow wheel, the joystick or the touchscreen to choose your option. I know some people prefer spot or center weighted, but I like multi-metering and that's where it's going to stay. There is one final set and forget option that I never actually changed on my camera, but I know a lot of people are interested in back button focus. Almost every video I do, someone asks a question about this, so I thought I should at least mention it among your list of options. For the record, I understand why people use back button focus, but I just can't break my old habit, so I still focus using the front button. If you want to do the same, you don't have to change anything, but if you want to set up back button focus, here's how you do it. It's a two-stage process because you have to switch focus on the back button and also switch focus off on the front button. Go into the third part of the menu and select Focus Release Shutter. Find the AF/AE lock heading and select AF on. That's the back button taken care of. Now go to the Shutter AF heading and turn it off. Now when you get out of the menu, you'll see that focusing is done using the AF/AE lock button on the back of the camera, and shooting is still done from the button on the front. Now we come to the functions that I do need to change from time to time, and I'll start with one that I almost left in the set and forget category because I hardly ever change it. That's the image stabilizer. The G9 has one of the world's best image stabilizer systems, and I already made a couple of videos about it. If you use IS a lot the way I do, you need to remember to switch it off when using a tripod. Because most of my photography with this camera is wildlife and outdoor portraits that I shoot handheld, I leave it on pretty much all the time. If you have a suitable Panasonic lens, you can take advantage of the dual system, which combines both lens and camera body stabilization. In that case, all you have to do is switch it on the lens, and that enables the dual system. If you have an Olympus lens, you won't have access to the dual system, but you still have the exceptional in-body stabilizer, which you can switch on and off in the menu. But as I said, I keep my stabilizer switched on pretty much all the time. Next comes white balance, and I use AWB or auto white balance most of the time. That's because I shoot in RAW, so I can always readjust the white balance later. I do occasionally change my white balance if I'm doing a portrait shoot that involves a bit of video. I don't know a lot about editing videos, so when I do a portrait shoot I sometimes change my white balance to daylight just to give me a more consistent colour between video clips and stills. To set your white balance, start by pressing Function 2 to go into the quick menu. Then use the arrow wheel, the joystick or the touchscreen to select the white balance function and choose your preference. As I said, sometimes I use daylight and there are a bunch of other options as well, but 99% of the time I simply leave it on AWB. Now we come to photo style, and like white balance, this is something I rarely touch, I just leave it on standard. But when I shoot portraits and portrait videos, I sometimes prefer the softer look that comes with the portrait photo style. To change your photo style, again press Function 2 to go into the quick menu. Then use the arrow wheel, joystick or touchscreen to find the photo style heading and select your preference. Normally I shoot on standard, as I said, but here's where I can change to portrait, and for that matter black and white or a number of other style options. Of course, when I go back to my regular shooting, I put my photo style back to standard. Now we get to the functions I have to change all the time depending on the subject, and the first one I'm going to look at is the release mode. For still photography I use three main options: single shot, high speed continuous and super high speed pre-burst continuous. Switching between them is simple, just turn the release mode dial on the top left of the camera. The first spot on the dial is reserved for single shot. The second and third positions are for your continuous or burst shooting options, and you can assign which one goes where, which I'll show you in a moment. Single shot obviously shoots one photo with each press of the button. You might be thinking that you could leave the camera in burst mode and just touch the button quickly if you only want one photo. But the shutter button on the G9 is so sensitive that it's almost impossible to shoot just one shot in burst mode. Even a light press of the button fires off 2 or 3 frames. So if you're not shooting action and you don't want to be deleting lots of unwanted frames, that's the time to switch to single shot. High speed continuous is the one I use for most wildlife and portraits, where I'm happy to fire off a few frames at a time. It shoots 12 frames per second and makes it much easier to catch those quick moments you might miss using single shot. Then you have the super high speed PreBurst mode. I've already made a couple of videos on this, so here's just a quick outline. You have 2 options, SH1 which shoots up to 20 frames per second, and SH2 that shoots up to an incredible 60 frames per second. And both SH1 and SH2 start shooting the moment you focus. When you press the button, the camera records everything you shot, plus 0.4 of a second worth of shots captured before you press the button. This makes it great for fast action and subjects that require split-second timing. I find the PreBurst great for catching a bird in the moment of takeoff. So how do we set them up? As I said before, the first spot on the dial is always reserved for single shot, so I had to choose the burst style I wanted for the second and third spots on the dial. To do this, go into the first part of the menu and scroll a fair way down until you find the headings Burst 1 and Burst 2. In there you can select from the different burst options and then click Set. Whatever you choose for Burst Mode 1 will be assigned to position 2 on the Release Mode dial, and the option you choose for Burst Mode 2 will be assigned to the third spot on the dial. For the record, I assign Normal High Speed Burst to Burst Mode 1 and SH1 or Super High Speed Pre-Burst to Burst Mode 2. Finally we come to Focus, and this we have to split into 2 different headings, the Autofocus mode and the Autofocus Area mode. Starting with the Autofocus mode, you have 3 options. You can change them easily using the switch on the back of the camera. Let's look at what each one means. The top option on the dial is AFS or AFF, and I use AFS, so that's the one I'll be talking about. AFS is pretty straightforward. When you half press the button to focus, the camera focuses once and stays locked in place as long as your finger stays on the button. So having focus, the focus won't change until you take a photo, unless you take your finger off the button and focus again. I love AFS for non-moving subjects because I can focus exactly where I want to, then recompose my shot knowing the subject will stay in focus as long as I keep my finger on the button. When I'm working with moving subjects, I often switch to AFC or Autofocus Continuous. With AFC, when you keep your finger on the button, the focus continually adjusts itself. Here I'm shifting focus from one subject to another, but with moving subjects, all you have to do is keep your focus point on the subject and the camera will keep it in focus. That makes it great for moving subjects like birds in flight or a person walking on a beach. The last option on the focus dial is MF or Manual Focus. With Manual Focus you do the focusing yourself by turning the focus ring on the lens. I don't use it much, but when I do I find that focus peaking is a big help. With peaking, any part of the photo that's sharp turns blue. It looks a bit weird, but it really saves you having to strain your eyes trying to figure out if your photo's sharp or not. To enable focus peaking for Manual Focus, go into the third part of the menu, choose the Monitor Display heading, then find the peaking setting and make sure it's turned on. By the way, you don't have to use the focus switch on the back of the camera to go into Manual Focus. Just by flicking MF on the lens, you will be in Manual Focus no matter which position your focus mode switch is set to. My last piece of the G9 puzzle is the Autofocus Area mode. There are a bunch of options and everyone has their favourite, so like I said at the start, I can't tell you how to do it, I can only tell you how I do it. You find the Autofocus Area mode by pressing the Function 1 button, and then you can keep pressing it, or you can use the arrow wheel, the joystick or the touchscreen to choose the option you want. As you can see, there are a number of options, so I'm just going to talk about the ones I use and what I use them for. The one I probably use the most is Single Area. This gives me a lot of control over exactly what I focus on. I can make the focus area larger or smaller and I can move it around using the touchscreen, but usually I keep it as small as possible and in the centre. Combined with shooting in AFS, I can choose exactly what I want to focus on, then hold my finger down and compose the shot before shooting. For birds in flight and other types of action, it can be hard to keep a single focus point trained on an unpredictable moving subject, so now I use Custom Multi. This lets me work with an area of focus points rather than just one. I can make that area bigger and smaller and I can move it around, but usually I keep it in the centre and not too big. For things like birds in flight, the subject only needs to be near the centre of the frame and the camera will find it. It works great in combination with AFC for action shots like this. For portraits, I use the first item on the Function 1 screen, which is the Face Eye Body Detect. I find this is terrific for this kind of work. If the subject is further away, it will focus on the shape of the body, but as it comes closer, the camera will lock onto the face. When I get really close, it concentrates on the eyes. Combined with AFC, this makes it the obvious choice for portraits, and it's easy to keep the focus on a moving subject. This allows me to let my model move around and pose freely without constantly asking them to stop to allow me to focus. Wow, here we are almost at the end. So that's my look at what I think are most of the essential settings I use in my photography on the G9. But knowing them separately will only get you so far. You really need to know how to combine them. Right now it might seem like this is too much to keep track of, but remember a lot of those functions were set and forget, so I never changed them, and others I only change from time to time. So now here's how I put it all together in my day-to-day photography. As we established at the start, for all my still photos I always shoot RAW files and I always shoot in manual mode. My screen shows a constant preview, I always use front button focus, and my image stabilizer is on. That's true for just about everything. Now let's look at how I set things up for particular subjects. For simple, stationary subjects, which probably make up the bulk of my photography, I use auto white balance. Photo style is set to standard. I usually use continuous release mode and hold the button briefly to take just a couple of shots at a time, but I will sometimes switch to one shot release if I don't want a lot of wasted shots. For autofocus, I use AFS combined with single area, so that I can focus, recompose if necessary, and shoot. For moving subjects, and for me that's most often birds in flight, I still use AWB and my photo style is standard. I still use continuous release mode, but for autofocus I use AFC combined with custom multi-area focus. That way I can more easily lock onto the moving subject and then track it with a continuous autofocus. For seriously fast action and things that require split-second timing, I still use AWB and I still use standard photo style. My release mode is super high-speed PreBurst mode, usually SH1 at 20 frames per second. Focus methods can change depending on the subject. For a bird about to take off, I use AFS and single area, but for sports type action I might switch to AFC and custom multi. Finally, for portraits, I use AWB some of the time, but I often switch to daylight white balance if I'm planning to shoot some video as well. I also change my photo style to portrait, although I must admit I don't always remember. I use the regular high-speed continuous release mode. For autofocus, I use AFC combined with Face Eye Body Detect area mode, and this allows me and the model to move around freely and still keep the focus locked on. Well, we made it. That's by far the longest video I've ever done, and if you made it right to the end, you now know the whole story of how I use my Lumix G9. The only thing I haven't told you about is aperture, shutter speed and ISO, but those settings literally change from one shot to the next depending on the subject, the weather, the time of day and any number of other factors. If you are still getting to know your G9, I really hope you found something useful in all of this. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and then you'd better grab your camera and get out and do some practice. I'm Andrew Goodall of Nature's Image Photography. Thanks for watching.